My name is Christopher Campbell. I'm the managing consultant for an IT security firm named Redspin. We are based down in Carpinteria near Santa Barbara. We're one of the leading healthcare security firms in the nation. We've done over 100 hospitals, actually around 115 total hospitals to date, including many in the top 100. Doing HIPAA, IT security, application security, mobile device, and business associate risk, primarily in the healthcare industry. So really what I want to talk about is, when we talk about BYOD and bring your own device, first I want to kind of talk about how this is with the interaction between the doctor and the hospital. So this is an actual example from a hospital I was at recently, touring the emergency department with a privacy officer. The charge nurse in the emergency room stopped the privacy officer and said that this doctor called her and told her this: please tell Dr. Smith to take a picture of Ms. Jones' radiology results and text it. I thought the privacy officer was going to. There are the obvious security concerns here of just plain SMS text of patient information. So we'll kind of get into why do doctors think this is okay, and I think there's a difference between needing to understand the compliance side of it and then also understanding the capabilities of the technology itself. So when we look at the different issues here, what we're talking about is, on one hand, we have the provider and looking at how they're adopting mobile technology, their understanding of technology, any kind of training, use, whatever. Then you have the device, which, in the beginning, I think the device in its infancy is kind of the middleman between the doctor and the hospital in some ways. You have the capabilities, management, and configuration of the devices that kind of serves almost as a filter for the data and for the functionality in terms of how it's communicating on the right-hand side towards the healthcare organization. And the different components there: IT, info security, risk and privacy, and the HIPAA compliance group. What's always struck me is that there's a study from about 8 years ago from Damon Santola and Michael Macy out of Cornell about called the complex contagion. I'm not going to go into deep detail because it's a very extensive, complex study itself. But one thing they talk about is the credibility of information or the willingness to adopt an innovation requiring independent confirmation from multiple sources. And what they're really talking about here are long ties or strong ties and weak ties, and kind of how these different effects, how these different ties and relationships can dictate or lead to adoption and diffusion of information. So when we look here, the different stage, we talk about the initial purchase and adoption of the tech, knowledge of device usage and basic configurations. And this is really kind of the steps maybe somebody goes through in kind of figuring out what to do with their iPhone. Then you have from the purchase, the knowledge, basic configuration, and then at some point right here in the middle, you have this tipping point of where it crosses the barrier from personal communication or an entertainment device to that which can be used for work. What I like to call the Candy Crush effect. They can use their phone. And then so you have this critical mass, and then at that point they realize that they can start to use their device to, in effect, real work, not just display information, but actually communicate with patients and provide some real benefit to the patients and to the healthcare organization. And from that point, we're starting to evolve into more the secure usage of such devices, wearables, and biometric data. So when we look at the taking from the theory, we have strong ties and weak ties. And according to the theory, it says that you have strong and weak ties that form these wide bridges for adoption of information. So on one hand, you have the strong ties for the providers, which tend to be more those closer social and emotional type relationships, peer physicians and close friends. And on the other side, you have the weak ties, which are more the distant social relationships. But these are often patient early adopters of technology, and then vendors that are kind of pushing back on both the physician and the health organization to implement new technology or upgrade. So when you look at the cumulative effect of all these start to form what they would refer to as wide bridges that link the acquisition of information to actually acting on the information itself. So when you look at it from this perspective, you could almost call the operational ties here towards the bottom really the strong ties. These are the must-dos for the healthcare organization, for the physician or provider. You have privacy and compliance oversight. You have auditing, incident management, sanction programs, HIPAA, state regulations. And on the technical side, you have the need for IT to have visibility and control over the mobile device itself. The IT security's responsibility to actually lock down electronic PHI. And then you also have some issues dealing with interoperability between and encryption between the EMR, the department applications, and then any other patient-connected devices. So really what we need to do here is talk about how do we reinforce these bridges, because BYOD as a concept is something that we can't really, it's kind of a snowball at this point. We can't stop it. Physicians, providers, everybody are bringing in their own devices, and they are being used whether we like them or not. So what can we do to actually sort of create a stronger bridge, I guess you could say, and a better framework for this? And so when we look at the framework, we're talking about things like provider-to-provider secure texting and emailing of information, physician orders to nursing staff, down even to orders, say, down at the pharmacy level, allowing for direct messaging in a secure manner and in a loud manner between the provider and the patient. And then also from sort of a configuration standpoint, establishing the framework for what you want the device itself to do. You know, whether you're allowing VPN functionality, camera functionality, NFC exchange, Bluetooth, any manner in which that device can pass along or communicate patient information. And I think the big thing here is that as you're making these decisions is making sure all stakeholders are involved in decisions. One thing that we see time and time again at the hospitals where we've worked is that where you have gaps in participation, you also have gaps in compliance and security. We have seen this time and time again. At a hospital we did recently, and this was a major top 100 hospital, they implemented a brand new EMR system. And they went through the typical growing pains that many of you here have seen or felt dealing with a transfer either to a new EMR or an upgrade. But because one person in the privacy area, who is actually not even a manager but really more of an analyst level, was kind of left out of the loop in terms of establishing the business requirements and the entire framework for the system, it wasn't until about 2 months after the fact that they realized it was missing one key component that was actually critical, not necessarily from a HIPAA perspective, but from an Illinois state perspective, which was that all electronic physician orders have to have a statement at the bottom showing that the physician is attesting this is done with an e-signature. This system completely lacked that altogether. Because she wasn't in the room, she had never been invited to a single meeting, and she was basically the only person in this hospital that knew that that was a requirement. So again, don't just leave participation in these things up to your IT staff, a handful of physicians, and maybe just the management level at the privacy and compliance area. A good thing here is that, and I say this is because one thing we see that is healthy is embracing conflicting within an environment like this. A push and pull is actually a good thing. In most cases, what we see is that, doctors, patient care staff, and others typically never have good things to say about IT. IT people typically never have good things to say about the patient care staff, and it's because they're approaching things from a completely different perspective. IT typically does understand the technology and the capabilities and what, the benefits to the hospital of what upgrading from version 5 to version 6 can accomplish that the physician may not typically understand. However, IT is not going to understand the nuances of how some of these technology upgrades or maybe even adding new technology can improve patient care. But at the same time, you do have to draw lines. And just as IT needs to understand that, back to Olivia's point earlier, of having those with a more technical background, those that are crafting, whether it's code, doing the back-end architecture, they need to understand the ethics and the implications of what they're designing, because ultimately it can affect patient outcome. On the other side, sort of on the compliance and privacy side, providers also need to understand that a line has to be drawn as well, that security and privacy, they're ultimately responsible for protection of PHI. And if they say no to something, in many ways there's not much you can do about it other than just simply find a way. And that's really a big point of what I want to get across here is don't take speed bumps as final. Just simply never take absolutely not as an answer. Just say, find a way to work out and find a solution. So when you talk about the responsibility of providers, in terms of from us in security, here's where we see a responsibility on that end is only texting or using or emailing PHI if it's using some kind of secure intermediary, an enterprise app, subscription service, or anything using some kind of point-to-point encryption. The second point here is actually kind of important. If accessing it, know that it's supported by IT and compliance. There's a lot of newer EMR apps or EMR applications that have sort of modules or tangent modules in which they're not officially supported by a mobile device, but every mobile device has a browser. And so even with it supporting just the browser, you may not necessarily be getting a true secure connection or transfer of information there. So, you want to make sure that if you're accessing a particular module, make sure that IT has given you the green light on that, or that it's been cleared by security somehow. The providers really do need to be as transparent with IT as they would for patient care. And again, this goes back to making sure that providers communicate as much as possible the benefit to themselves, to the patient, healthcare organization, what the use of this technology would allow for them. And then to my point earlier, understand state regulations as much as HIPAA. The state regulations are getting where they have a lot more teeth than some of the federal regulations, and I think and a lot of the state regulations are getting overlooked at the IT implementation phase. So when we talk about establishing the patient interface, and I'm going to use the word portal here as kind of a catch-all. This can be, portal just simply be a gateway, whatever the communication method, channel, or whatever you allow. But just make sure you plan out and it's communicated what is allowed. Risk and privacy officers will need to document all allowed usage, interface, and policies and procedures. If you're allowing, and I do believe personally that direct messaging between patients and providers can be a good thing. I read a study recently, or an article recently here in MedMobile, that talked about how it can increase efficiency for responding to patient questions, loyalty from patients to be higher as well. It just goes back to find a secure way to do it. Don't just text patient information just because you can. And then the second part is don't be afraid of social media. I think here, again, with me being based in the East, I think there's a vast cultural difference between how social media and healthcare is handled in the West versus the East. East Coast tends to be much more conservative in this regard, and going near social media in many cases is not even an option for them. And what I've told doctors and hospitals is don't be afraid of it. Just figure out the best way to do it. I mean, obviously you're not going to do something stupid like tweet out to your patient, "Hey, you've got cancer." But figure out the best way to do it to improve your practice, improve the relationship and improve the relationship from a reputational standpoint in the healthcare organization and the patient themselves too. And I believe providers and hospitals have just as much responsibility to educate a patient. You don't want vendors or third parties actually educating. And I think this goes back to something I've seen as a common theme for the past day and a half is where kind of as social media and technology evolves, what is the role of a physician? Because they're gradually becoming cut out of the loop. I don't think that should be the case in terms of they are still the subject matter expert. You just need to kind of figure out a way to have these these third parties supplement the information they have, but I think ultimately you do need to rely on the advice, opinion of your personal physician or a group of physicians rather than simply crowdsourcing your own diagnosis. But the organization, regardless, needs to state clearly what they will communicate and not communicate. And I say this because, from a social engineering standpoint, one of the things that we see with banking is that, banks will tell you, we will never, ask you for your account number, social security number, whatever, up front. I think hospitals, other than getting people to sign a HIPAA statement, maybe at check-in, I don't think they've done a great job at actually saying, here's what we will and will not communicate with you. And the last point here is listen to your most tech-savvy patients. And the good thing is we have a fair share here at this conference who are way more tech-savvy than the typical patient. And I think they need to, in some ways, push providers along to accept technologies and to find better ways to use it without letting the tail wag the dog, and meaning understand how to do it again in a compliant and secure manner. So IT security also has kind of a whole set of must-dos here. Implementing mobile device management, which is, again, sort of centralized control over the device from an IT perspective. There's always going to be gaps in terms of, I can have MDM in place that will dictate, only certain allowed usage. It will allow me to access only certain sites and VPN to certain locations, but that doesn't necessarily stop me from picking it up and taking a picture of a chart. I mentioned the example in the beginning. So where you have those gaps, make sure you have signed agreements and policies in place. IT and needs to work with the end users to actually have an ongoing list of supported devices, OS versions, and configurations to force authorization. And this is where we say, okay, if you're using an iOS device, it requires version 6.0 or 5.0 and up to even access any resource in the network. And then mapping PHI at all storage, entry, and exit points. Again, this also helps understand if you don't know what your data is or where your data is, you can't protect it. And then IT needs to also kind of challenge the providers and vendors when called for and not hesitate to be the bad cop. What, again, something we do see quite a bit is that vendors are giving physicians and providers poor information about how to use a system or how to use a mobile device with a system. Because typically a vendor will give advice that makes it the easiest for them to support, not what is in the best interest of the healthcare organization or necessarily the most compliant way to do it. So then as we evolve from just this device that is where you have the physician or provider using their phone or mobile device, tablet as some kind of middleman to communicate information with the hospital, I think it becomes a lot more transparent and these bridges, so to speak, widen out to where a lot of that information and most of that information will start originating from the patient, using things like wearable devices, tattoos, implants, communicating with smartphones and tablets, and then all that being passed through from the provider to the healthcare organization. And I think this is a very important distinction here because, again, you've taken the device out as sort of the intermediary. Right now, so you take it, you've empowered the patient to a degree to actually have these devices that is collecting this information, aggregating it, providing it to the provider. And in many cases, I think where I see the benefit there is not so much in the analysis end, but more so in the providing all the information up front for a provider or a team of patient care staff to be able to make a proper diagnosis. So as these devices are evolving, I think what we're looking at is kind of in two segments here, is apps for wearables emerging, and they really are already emerged in that sense. So on one hand, you have the patient-managed apps for healthcare monitoring, and this can be as basic as the Fitbit and Jawbone devices, up to some of the newer devices that are doing heart rate monitoring, blood pressure, things like that. And then on the other end, you have apps from the healthcare and IT vendors that are actually doing true collection and analysis of data. Many of you may have seen this week, or this past week, the FDA issued a new ruling on mobile device regulation or app regulation, kind of saying what they will and will not regulate. And essentially what they're saying that they will regulate is a minority of apps that are related to data analysis or aggregation. And primarily it's on the second one here of the apps that are doing some kind of critical analysis, not just aggregation or a collection of data. And in many cases, these are apps that are dependent upon some kind of hardware device physically attaching to a tablet or to a phone. Things that are doing not just heart rate monitoring, but also doing true EKG type analysis or true blood pressure, breathing rate type monitoring. MDM and security control is actually going to become more critical as these devices emerge, these wearables, because what you're going to see is, right now there's very few of them that are wireless enabled, particularly. Some of the implants, most of the wearables are, but as you start to get into the tattoos, the skin grafts, the things like that that are able to pass information, they're going to start to become wireless enabled, and at that point they start forming ad hoc wireless networks. And so at this point you've got PHI that is kind of going around in this ad hoc network between a patient's device, potentially a provider's device, their own device that's on them, either implanted or that they are wearing it. And at that point, the IT security and IT groups for the hospital or the healthcare organization and risk and privacy have been completely cut out of the loop. From a compliance perspective and from a security perspective, this is a fairly risky thing as far as we're concerned. But it's something that will happen, and I think that the security will evolve rather soon. And I think because of how this, I think what you're going to start to see is that the patient will have to become an equal partner in safeguarding ePHI. Right now, that primary responsibility is between the healthcare organization, the providers, and then their business associates, via the business associate agreements and service level agreements. But I think what you're going to see happen is because of the kinds of information that patients are going to be gathering themselves with their own personal devices, and then what the app vendors and these wearable vendors are, I think you're going to start to see many healthcare organizations start to shift some of that legal liability over. Because trust me, if there is a way that some of these hospitals can figure out how to shift legal liability and responsibility off of themselves, they absolutely and the last point I want to make, and I don't, this really isn't on the slide itself, is that most security experts will tell you, IT and security experts will tell you that the whole concept of BYOD is way too risky to actually continue as an acceptable business practice. And this is not to go back on everything that I've just said, but they're absolutely right. Everything that we talked about, or I mentioned here, really should almost be considered, in terms of the actual physician or provider mobile device, should really be considered almost a stopgap. In the long run, it is too risky to have somebody bring in a device and provide health care with that device that they've also been playing Angry Birds on, or whatever. Just as in most, virtually all corporations or healthcare organizations, you would not be allowed to bring your own laptop in to do the same thing. And you're talking about devices already between Android and Apple devices that have the same computing power as a laptop. So why would you allow one and not the other? So ultimately, I think that what we will see is BYOD. A lot of people are looking at it right now is that they think there's a cost savings by allowing, but hey, we don't have to buy these devices and we don't have to pay AT&T or Verizon. We can let the doctors come in and do it themselves. I think ultimately there's going to be the cost of supporting that and the cost of the legal and other liability issues related to that are going to far outweigh any kind of sort of upfront financial benefit of allowing those devices. That's all I have. Are there any questions I can answer?